In this video, we'll introduce the central nervous system. Now, when we're talking the central nervous system, let's remind ourselves that we're really looking at the brain and the spinal cord. And it's full of many functions, but if we want to break the functions into big categories, it's about receiving information from the peripheral nervous system, and then the central nervous system interprets that sensory information. It also has a large role in homeostasis. We're going to see that many control centers, especially located in the brain stem area, control things such as or have an influence over heart rate, breathing, vasodilation, which is the diameter of your blood vessels, and a number of other things. So maintaining homeostasis is one of the big factors. And functions related to the mind, that concept of consciousness, your place in the world, your interpretation of your environment. Now, we can also have a look at the central nervous system in terms of its roles in terms of motor functions. So, of course, we know motor functions are basically relate to the stimulation of muscle cells, contraction, or gland secretion. Now, this is eventually carried out by the peripheral nervous system, but many of the game plans, many of the details of how that motion is going to occurs in the central nervous system. So the game plan is created in the central nervous system and then sent out to the peripheral nervous system to, as I said, muscles and glands to carry out the action. Sensory functions. So detection of sensory functions within and without the body are the function of the CNS, yet most of this information does make its way to the central nervous system. Also, when we're looking at the central nervous system, there's a lot of integration that occurs. And really, integration is an exclusive function of the CNS. What do I mean by that? I mean this is really one of the jobs that the CNS has. The PNS really is not involved with integrative. So what do I mean by integrative functions? Well, here's some examples. So the interpretation of the sensory information. So yes, the sensory information does come in from the peripheral nervous system, but it's the central nervous system that decides to pay attention to it. And if it does, should it act on it? And if so, how should it act on it? So we also have planning and monitoring of movement, maintenance of homeostasis, and higher functions such as language and learning, cognition, right? Understanding the world, being able to think your way through things. Now let's talk a bit about the actual brain itself. So often when you see a brain outside the body in terms of like a brain dissection, that brain is being preserved, and the preservative actually changes the consistency of the brain. That really the brain is much softer than most people have the concept that it is. And it's a grayish-white organ, and it connects with the spinal cord, and of course it inhabits your head, and it's within a cranial cavity. So it's really well protected by the bones of the skull. And it directly or indirectly controls most of the body functions. Now, I'd never ask you this weight, but to give you an idea, it's somewhere between about 1,250 to about 1,450 grams. And it is mostly made of nervous tissue, but that we do see some other tissues that are associated with the brain, and there's some epithelia and some connective tissues. Now, within the brain, we have a number of internal cavities which make up the ventricular system, the ventricles, and these are filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and we'll talk about those in greater detail. Now, the brain is very metabolically active and receives about 20% of the blood flow during at rest. And this really gives you an idea that how much the brain relies upon oxygen, glucose, and nutrients. It needs a continuous supply. And we can see that if only a few seconds of cutting off airflow or blood flow to the brain is enough to start to cause a disruption to its activities. Let's just have a quick look at the brain structure. So the brain, these are the big parts of the brain. Of course, these big parts can all be subdivided into many other parts. But let's just start with the big major parts. So there are 4 divisions. and each distinct in its type of input it received and where the output is sent. So we have part one, which is the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is what you see here in the brown gray. So cerebrum, you can see this is all cerebrum right up here. It's that sort of grayish brown material. And we can see that it has ridges and folds, sulci and gyri. We'll see that's what they're called. Now, just as a quick snapshot, in a very large way, what are the major functions of the cerebrum? They perform higher mental functions. They interpret sensory stimuli, and they help to plan and initiate motion. Right? Now let's go to the next bit. Now this bit is not, it's shown shaded here because they're trying to represent that it's deep within the brain. Deep within here. It's deeper to what we're looking at right here. And this is a diencephalon, and that's this area right here. And what does it do? It does process, it integrates, and it relays information. It has a role in homeostasis, the maintenance of homeostasis, and regulates biological rhythms. And once again, we're going to come back and look at it because there's a number of nuclei in there that have various roles. And then as we look at other major parts of the brain, we can see the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is down here, this area right here. Now it's partially obscured by some of the overhanging cerebrum. And it actually has two parts. We're going to see both the cerebellum have two hemispheres. And what does it do? It monitors and coordinates motion. Now we'll come back and, of course, get more detailed about that. And then the next major part is the brain stem. And the brain stem makes up a number of parts, the medulla, the pons, etc. But we'll get back to those details. But let's have a quick look. So the brain stem is the purple that we can see. You can see some of it is exposed here because it's not overlaid with cerebrum, and some of it it looks a bit deeper from here, but from the front we could have a clearer view of it. And the brain stem maintains homeostasis, controls certain reflexes, monitors movement, and integrates and relays information. So not surprising, a lot of information does come up through the brainstem from the peripheral nervous system to get distributed to parts of the brain, and a lot of information, like motor information, does come down through the brainstem on its way to the spinal cord and eventually out to peripheral nerves to cause either muscles to act or glands to act. Okay, so the cerebrum, it's in large portion, and it's divided into cerebral hemispheres, the left and the right. And each of the hemispheres is actually subdivided into 5 lobes. And it's divided because within each lobe we have groupings of neurons that perform specific tasks. And it really is responsible for the higher functions. It has big role in learning, memory, personality, cognition, which is basically thinking, language, and consciousness. But it also has major roles in sensation and movement, interpreting sensory information, putting together motor game plans to actually go ahead and have motion occur. The diencephalon, sometimes it's called diencephalon, you can pronounce it either way. It's deep underneath, and it's the central core of the brain, and it has 4 distinct structural and functional parts. So it's responsible for processing, integration, relaying information to different parts of the brain. It helps to sort through information coming up, sensory information, and deciding which part of the brain should it be sent to. It also has homeostatic functions. It has regulation of movement and biological rhythms. And once again, we'll get into some of these a bit more detail. We're just having a quick overview at this point. The cerebellum is posterior and inferior to the brain, and it's divided into left and right hemispheres. And this has a really big role in planning and coordination of movement, especially complex activities like playing sports or instruments, tying your shoes, and a whole bunch of other things. So it does a lot of this, and we'll have a look at structure. And the brain stem connects the brain to the spinal cord and is involved in basic and voluntary homeostatic functions. There's a lot of nuclei control centers in the brainstem for respiration, associated with the cardiovascular system also. Control certain reflexes and monitoring of movement. Things like proprioception, things like that. We have tracks for proprioception. Proprioception is knowing where your body is in three-dimensional space. Integrating and relaying information to the other parts of the brain stem. And once again, a great diagram to start on. So spend some time, identify the major areas of the brain, get to know their basic overall functions, and from there you can move on in your knowledge and get deeper and deeper. Always start with the big picture, the big overviews, and then get into the details. Now the spinal cord is a long tubular organ protected by the vertebral cavity, and it basically is a continuation. It more or less blends with the inferior portion of the brain stem, and it also only goes down to about the first or second lumbar vertebrae. It doesn't go all the way down, and we'll talk about its anatomy much more down the road. Now, the brain, as I mentioned, had ventricles, fluid-filled ventricles. In the middle of the spinal cord is something called the central canal, and it's the internal cavity within the spinal cord, and it is continuous to the brain's ventricles, and it does contain cerebral spinal fluid. Now, when we're looking at the brain and spinal cord, we'll see that we have white matter and gray matter. And both in the brain and spinal cord, white matter is because I have myelinated axons. Each lobe of the cerebrum contains bundles of white matter, and of course we call these tracts. Remember, the equivalent of that would be a nerve in the peripheral nervous system. Remember, tracts are a bundle of axons traveling together. But in this case, they're myelinated, so it's white matter. It receives input from and sends input to clusters of cell bodies and dendrites in the gray matter, which are the nuclei. So really, when you're looking at white matter, you're really looking at mostly myelinated axons that are carrying information from one place to the next. Where you see gray matter, that's really what you're looking at, and mostly are cell bodies, because the cell bodies aren't really myelinated. So it's cell bodies and dendrites. And of course, a collection of cell bodies in the central nervous system is they're known as nuclei. The spinal cord contains white matter tracts, and these tracts, and we'll look at the anatomy of a cross-section of spinal cord in other chapters. These tracts are basically carrying sensory information up to higher centers, or motor information down from higher centers and eventually out to the peripheral nervous system. And because they're myelinated, they look white, so they're the white matter tracts. Now, gray matter is both in the brain and spinal cord, and these are neuronal cell bodies. These are where dendrites are and unmyelinated axons. So where do we tend to find this? We find that the outer few millimeters of the cerebrum is gray matter, and the deeper portions are mostly white matter with some gray matter scattered throughout, and we'll come back to that concept. The spinal cord is mostly gray matter in the cord center and processes information. The surrounding tracts are white matter on the outside and relay information to and from. Communication between gray and white matter connects different regions of the brain and spinal cord to one another, myelinated axons, and allows very quick communication. Now, we should note this, is that if I look at the brain, so the upper parts of the brain, cerebrum, this is a quick sketch of the brain, that really, when it comes to the brain, the gray matter is really the outer surface. All those folds you see and dips that you see in the brain, it's a very thin layer of gray matter. And also in the brain, we have islands of gray matter that are deep within it, which are associated with things like nuclei. So when I'm looking at the brain, it's mostly gray matter on the outside with islands on the inside. Now what's deep within the brain? We have a lot of tracts, and these are myelinated tracts that are carrying information from one area to the next. Because there's a lot of tracts that have to carry information from, say, this part of the brain to that part of the brain, so they can work together to process. So once again, the outside of the brain, largely gray matter. The brain also has islands of gray matter deep within, but mostly inside of the brain, it's myelinated tracts carrying information from one area to the next, or it's information coming in from below being distributed, or information heading out like motor information. Okay, so now when we look at the spinal cord, it's quite a different thing. In the spinal cord, I'm going to draw a cross section of the spinal cord. Okay, spinal cord. Where do we find the white matter? The white matter in the spinal cord is in the periphery. That's really where it is. And what's here is that if we actually look, there's bundles, there's regions of the spinal cord that carry bundles of myelinated axons. And that's why this is all white matter. Because out here we basically have highways or tracks of myelinated axons that are either carrying information up to the central nervous system or information down from the central nervous system. So this is where I would see the white matter. Whereas the gray matter in the spinal cord occupies the middle region. And that's a significant difference between the two of them. And we can see it here on the diagram. You can see that here the gray matter, very thin gray matter, that is the unmyelinated. You can see the white matter here. So this would actually consist of tracts carrying information from one area of the brain to other areas of the brain. And you can see it's quite extensive. Now, you can see that I do have the white matter here, but there are islands of gray matter that are also deep in the brain. So the brain is gray matter on the outside, a lot of white matter, which are tracts carrying information from one region to the next, or carrying information from front to back, or from side to side, and we'll have a look at that. And gray matter is... there's gray matter islands within here. Whereas the spinal cord, as I said, here is white matter. All this is white matter, and those are individual tracts that are carrying myelinated axons, okay, tracts. They're carrying information up to central nervous system, or up to the brain, I should say, and back, or taking information out to the peripheral nervous system. And here we have the gray matter, and you can see the gray matter. It actually does look different. When you look at it, you notice there's a difference. Okay, so that is a quick overview of the brain, and we'll leave it there, and we'll come back and pick up the next subjects in the next video.